In this episode, I host a dialogue between Lama Justin van Buydash and Charlie Morley. Justin van Buydash is an American Buddhist teacher, dark retreat yogi, founder and spiritual director of Yangti Yoga Retreat Center in Buckland, Massachusetts, and author of Modern Tantric Buddhism. Charlie Morley is an English lucid dream and dream yoga teacher, authorized by the Karma Kagyu sect of Tibetan Buddhism, and best-selling author of several books, including the recently reissued Dreams of Awakening. Justin and Charlie share their extensive experience as modern teachers of Vajrayana, compare notes on the state of Tantra in the West, and reflect on the responsibility of openly teaching previously restricted esoteric practices. Justin and Charlie wrestle with the tension between conserving traditional religious forms and innovating to meet today's moral sensibilities and technological currents. They suggest changes they would like to see in both Asian Buddhist cultures and Western society. Consider the pros and cons of long meditation retreats in today's world, and call for hierarchical equality for women practitioners and teachers. I invite Justin and Charlie to reveal the underlying principles that guide their desired reforms, and consider the pitfalls of advocating change without awareness of one's guiding rationale. Justin and Charlie also discuss the role of neuroscience in the furthering of Buddhist understanding, reveal the potential trauma healing power of dream yoga and dark retreat, and share their thoughts on the impact of fatherhood on one's religious life. So without further ado, Lama Justin van Buydash and Charlie Morley. Lama Justin van Buydash and Charlie Morley, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Steve. Pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm so delighted that you're both here. Wow, what a dream team combination this is, to discuss Vajrayana and related themes in the 21st century. When I proposed this dialogue to the both of you, I was very pleased, of course, that you said yes, and also very, very interested by your responses. Justin, you said you were looking forward to discussing the specifics, this is to quote you now, how important the work you're both doing is in relationship to moving the needle of integrating Vajrayana Dharma into a Western cultural context. That's very interesting indeed. And Charlie, to quote you, you said, a phrase you used is making Vajrayana as accessible and radical as it should and could be. That's quite interesting indeed. So when we think about those themes, Vajrayana in the 21st century, in 2025, accessible, radical, integrated, etc., what is the state, in your opinion, of the Dharma in 2025?
Okay. This is a really good question, Steve. Thank you. And yeah, I mean, I think that the state of the Dharma in 2025 is, well, let's put it this way. The world has changed probably more in the past 30 years than it has changed maybe in the past, century, or definitely within the past 40 years. The Dharma is alive and well. I think ultimately, in the ultimate sense, the Dharma is just, it is what it is. I think we're living in a very distracted time where we have developed these kinds of economies and technologies that are algorithmized to kind of, fit us as closely as possible and sell things and keep us going and being distracted and things like this. So what I'm interested in, and to, kind of borrow Charlie's word about, making or keeping Dharma radical, is, how can we approach Dharma in a way that is ultimately disruptive of these kinds of mechanisms that we've created through capitalism and other structures that keep us really distracted, right? Really, just in one small kind of place, rather than the kind of more explosive nature of, recognizing the Rigpa state. So I see Dharma now as an essential tool for in one way, even we could say the survival of the species, in the sense that, opening up to the vastness of the nature of our minds imbues us with the ability to think differently and approach one another with an open heart, to be able to manifest compassion, but then also to be able to have the wisdom to see through some of the responses that need to be in place for us to address, things like the climate crisis, which we're seeing like play out everywhere in the world, but then all of this political instability too. So it seems to me, maybe this is just my bias, that Dharma seems more vital a tool and a means or a technique to be able to kind of address this growing complexity and intensity that we see in the world right now. So Dharma's here, Dharma's strong, but I think a lot more work is needed to be able to integrate it into our daily lives. Charlie, I'm curious, what do you, on the other side of the...
Very interesting. As you're speaking, Lama Justin, I was thinking of something that Steve spoke to me about recently, actually. We sometimes have exchanges on WhatsApp. Usually when I'm doing the housework, I always listen to Guru Viking Podcast, including the several you've done with Steve, while I do the cleaning. And there's something about this kind of purification of literally cleaning while I'm listening to these Dharma talks. And anyway, in one of our exchanges, Steve made an interesting point. He said that so often you hear about the older generation of Dharma practitioners talking about how they met the 16th Karmapa, for example, and their eyes met across the room and they saw him in illusory body light form, or, that famous photo of him where he's doing the Chenrezi empowerment, you can see right through him. And I know stories of him being able to get through birds, through customs at Glasgow airport by doing some sort of thing where he was able to stun the security officers and get these birds through. And I know someone who was actually there when that happened. And Steve was making the point that you don't seem to get so many stories like that today. In my opinion, in the kind of 20 years that I've been in this scene, so I took refuge with Akon Rinpoche when I was 19, so let's say about 20 years or so. The big shifts that I've seen, and something I'm very optimistic about, is the practices which are being offered now. 20 years ago, you would not be able to find them publicly offered at all. I mean, the type of dark retreats that you're doing, Justin, Tumo being taught openly by people like Tulku Lobsang Rinpoche, the dream yoga practices being offered so much more openly, a whole retreat center being set up to lead people into dark retreat. Just a couple of decades ago, there is no way, unless maybe it was there and I just couldn't see it, but there was no way that was open and accessible to Western Dharma practitioners. Now it is. And I think that's a very optimistic state to be in. That yes, there may be fewer stories about people, having these mystical encounters with lineage holders as there was in the older generations, but there's a hell of a lot more people doing real serious Vajrayana practice. There's a hell of a lot more accessibility for people to do serious Vajrayana practice than there seemed to be 20 years ago. And I think that's cause for celebration. I've definitely seen it with dream yoga, the kind of veils of secrecy, which were so strongly imparted on the Western Sanghas 20 years ago, maybe 10 years ago or something, they started to become slightly removed. And now I think, dream yoga practice is being offered so much more openly, as well as the dark retreats and Tumo and these very powerful yogas. So that's my thoughts on it, about the state of Dharma in 2025. For an optimistic view, I think that actually the accessibility of practices now is greater than it's ever been before. I think the pandemic actually in many ways was great for people's Dharma accessibility, because so much of stuff went onto Zoom, and so many people were able to do practices and connect with teachers that they may not have done had it not been for that. And also the realist in me sees what's about to happen to the world in a couple of weeks, with people coming into power and natural disasters. And as you said, the climate crisis, and still the kind of elephant in the room in most Dharma centers about the inherent whiteness of most Western Sanghas, and still nuns, be they Western or Himalayan or from anywhere, still having to sit behind the monks and stuff. There's so much work to be done. But on an optimistic point, I think the practice is a lot more accessible now than they were 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm curious, Charlie, what do you think, what changed? Like what changed than what you've seen, especially, in the Sangha that you've been part of? Like what changed from when you
I think in the Sangha I've been part of, not a lot changed, actually. It wasn't actually, because I lived at Samazon for like 7 years, and Samazon Kagyu Center, as you know, and often, as we've reflected together, I think often the inherent monasticism found within the Kagyu tradition means that some of the more yogic practices are not freely open, are not freely offered, and that it is a more conservative view or presentation of the Dharma than you might get in certain Nyingma centers and the Dzogchen centers and stuff like that. So I don't know if I saw that change within my own Sangha. But I think something happened like it's in the last 5 years around COVID. I mean, when you started emerging, obviously you've been doing this stuff for a long time. You came onto my radar about 3 years ago, and I was hearing about the Dark Retreat Center, and of course, Dr. Nida, who's done so much in the last 5 years. Again, maybe I was living under a rock, but it seemed about 5 years ago, suddenly Dr. Nida was doing a lot. And before I came into contact with him, it was his students. I just kept on meeting these really dynamic, young-ish, if I can call myself young-ish, like 40 and younger, 30s and 40s practitioners. And so many of them seem to lead back to Dr. Nida or Dr. Nida's Sangha. And I think there was some shift around there around the pandemic. Maybe it was stuff going online. And now the Dark Retreat Center. I don't know. I don't know what shifted, but something has in the last 5 years, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I also agree with you on like the conservatism that you kind of find in the Karma Kagyu tradition as being, on one level, I can understand it because I spent a lot of time in Sikkim. This is kind of like where I connected with the Karma Kagyu. But I do think its Achilles kind of heel is its conservatism, and especially tantric practices. I agree with you also about the pandemic being this cause for an explosion of especially things like empowerments online. And I was talking with Dr. Nida about this just in the beginning of December. We were talking about hearing some teachers being very critical of empowerments being given online because they were the claim being made was that it was the actual substances to be ingested at various points, from a bumba or from a kapala or something like this, or having, ritual objects, touched to your head or hands as being a major part of the empowerment. And then, when you look at things from the Mahamudra and Dzogchen kind of view, it's all in the Rigpa state to begin with, right? It's like, this is the point of origin. And then, maybe you could say there's some kind of like transference through symbol. But what does it awaken? It awakens, the mind, which is naturally awake as it is. And I like having these conversations with people like Dr. Nida because it also allows us to begin to kind of get into what we might call the kind of technology of transmission. And I think that there has been a lot of really interesting conversation, maybe not necessarily centralized around online empowerments being given. I've also heard stories of people making recordings of great teachers giving empowerments to be saved for the future as well, which is also something that's kind of like interesting to consider. Is like, let's say, His Holiness the Dalai Lama was going to give a series of empowerments in the future, and they were all to be recorded and then shared in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, or even, is this a way of keeping some of these transmissions alive?
Very interesting.
It is.
Justin, can I ask you something on that point? Because it's so strange you brought this up. I was thinking about this literally like 2 days ago. I was brushing my teeth, and I don't know why this came up in my head, but I was thinking about online empowerment, exactly as you said. And in some way, I understand that when I'm present with the teacher, literally at the foot of the teacher, I want to be 100% zoned in on that empowerment. I am there because I'm aware that I'm in their space. I'm aware they're witnessing me. I'm aware they can feel my eyes on them. So it feels from a personal level, an egoic level anyway, that an in-person empowerment for me would be more of a powerful experience than online. Because when I'm doing it online, I might be like playing with the dogs at the same time. Someone might ring the doorbell, this kind of stuff. And yet, surely isn't the grossest manifestation of the empowerment process the substance? And if we truly understand the truth of emptiness, it makes absolutely no difference whether you're 1 meter from the Lama or 1,000 miles from the Lama. Because the empty nature of mind means the time and space locality is like out the window, right? Empowerment is blessing, and blessing doesn't matter whether you're 1 meter or 1 mile away, right? So surely online empowerments, if we're truly present and can accept the blessing, it makes no difference if we're ingesting the physical substances. Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, what it makes me think of also is like empowerments in dreams.
I was exactly about to say that. Like, surely an empowerment in a dream is the very essence of the empty nature of the empowerment. And yet, absolutely, the empowerment, and not just the empowerment, the experiences we have in the dreams. Are we to say that they're of less value because they were in a space that was non-physical or seemingly non-physical? Surely that kind of throws the whole idea of the empty nature of reality out the window. If we say it's only real if it happens in the waking state, right? The real world. What is real?
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that, you know, the existence of or the ability to receive empowerments in the dream state, or teachings or transmissions or blessings, you know, directly. I mean, that already begins to kind of poke a hole in this idea that anything in whatever we call this tangible reality is the basis through which, you know, empowerment or transmission is given. Yeah, I mean, you know, it's fascinating because in this conversation with Dr. Nita, somehow we got on the conversation of the Pope, and, you know, what would it be? So, like, you know, giving the Pope can give, you know, conduct mass, right, online, and it's not.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. Okay, so that's a thing in the Catholic Church.
Well, it's done. I don't, you know, people don't necessarily wouldn't perhaps say that it's the same thing, you know, taking the Eucharist and all of this kind of thing. But again, if your faith is there, if this is, you know, if you have pure vision or, you know, pure view, then who is to say, you know, what the difference is? And I think this does get really interesting in terms of technology and the survival of Dharma. I mean, you know, it's fascinating to kind of look at I'm a little bit involved in this, and I know people that are also involved in trying to kind of rediscover different texts in different Vajrayana practice cycles. You know, working with scholars and things like this to kind of reconstitute the transmission lineage of different kinds of texts. And over the course of Tibetan history, texts have been lost for so many different reasons. You know, sometimes, you know, conquest of one tradition over another, the politics, you know, involved in that, wars, or then, of course, you know, the Chinese invasion of Tibet and all of the destruction since then. Technology now seems to really offer a kind of hopeful revisioning of. I mean, you know, it's fascinating in Vajrayana. You take something like the Dharma tradition. I mean, this is already something like it imbues a potential for constant refreshment. Right? The finding of Dharma that keeps, you know, particular blessings and practices alive and relevant. And it's fascinating to look at some of the technology that we've created as a means to be able to do this. In early November, right after the election, I went down to Arkansas to receive the Nityagabshi empowerments from Loka Rinpoche, who came from Katok Monastery in Tibet, to offer them. And he was telling this story at one point about how Kempo Jigme Punsuk kept he had one long pecha from the Lama Yangti printed that he wore around his body to protect him during the Cultural Revolution. And, it's said that if you have one volume of the Lama Yangti by your head and you die, it's kind of like an instant poa. So he kind of kept this as a blessing for him. And there was somebody present at the empowerments who was a scientist who we were talking about, and he happened to be a specialist in this kind of like micro engraving, and how you'd be able to, and he was looking at doing this, like engraving the entire Lama Yangti in such a tiny detail that you could have the entire thing on one little pendant. Right? And so it raises really interesting questions about the creation of even new, amulets and things like this. So it is, I mean, it's funny, like, people are always talking about, oh, we live in the degenerate time and, everything's terrible now. The great masters of the past had it easier. Practitioners in the past had it easier. But it is really fascinating to see how some of this like new integrated technology can kind of propel forward some of these benefits that I'm sure future generations will be able to make fruit.
Absolutely. And just kind of riffing off that, Justin, something again I think I've spoken to Steve about. One of my kind of, again, an optimistic viewpoint I have on this like fourth turning of the wheel in the West is the unique contribution the West can give to Dharma, which hasn't been there before and is uniquely Western, I believe, is neuroscience. The ability to see what's going on in the brain of someone as they do these practices. And why should that matter? It matters because it's a point of inspiration and it brings more people onto the path. Like the study we did with the dream yoga, lucid dreaming that we did with the people working with trauma, and we found that lucid dreaming was a really powerful intervention for post-traumatic stress disorder. Why is that helpful to the Dharma path? Because it makes more people go, wow, this could be helpful for me. I think it's not only like a bodhisattva action because we do this research because it allows more people to see the benefit of Dharma, but also it brings them onto the path. There are now a lot more people who know that lucid dreaming / dream yoga is a practice that can help us integrate our trauma and work with our shadows. And the stuff that they're doing at Northwestern, I don't know if you come across that team at Northwestern University in Chicago. I was with them in January, and they're doing specifically not just lucid dreaming, but dream yoga neuroscience practices, which is very, very interesting, where you get hooked up to the brain scan of the full thing, the things under your nose, the muscle things on your chin, classic lucid dreaming scientific study. But once you become lucid and you flick your eyes left, right to say, I'm in here, you engage in dream yoga practice, not lucid dreaming, but full dream yoga practice. And they're trying to plot the neural correlates of someone engaging in, for example, clear light practice within the lucid dream or deity self-manifestation within the lucid dream to see what happens in the brain. And that stuff that really, it excites me so much. I actually completely failed when I went in. I was in the lab for 4 nights and got lucid like once. So I'm a complete fail on that one. But the potential of them being able to log the neural correlates of dream yoga, as well as those brilliant studies that Maria, the Russian friend of mine, I can't remember her last name, used to be doing at Harvard on Tumo practitioners, and seeing how the autonomic nervous system is affected by the Tumo breathing and the visualization and, plotting the neural correlates of that. I think that's something that's really exciting and is something uniquely predisposed to the Western mind, uniquely created in the West, and a unique gift that the West can offer to current Dharma.
Yeah, and we could even probably blow this out even more, where these kinds of studies and this kind of approach also begins to normalize what is held, typically on a very high pedestal.
Yes.
And so, with respect to especially trauma, and you had brought up the good point of whiteness and sanghas. I mean, one of the places in the United States we find considerable amount of trauma is within the context of the lives in communities of people of color, and to be able to actually introduce these practices, or the applicability of these practices, to be able to address
yes,
generational trauma that has arisen as a result of racism or classism or any number of long existing traumas that have existed over generations, or even amongst refugees from political instability or things like this. My family is of Hungarian origin, and everybody was displaced during World War II, and then displaced after the Soviets invaded, and from there came to the United States or Australia, and then the United States. And growing up, I saw a lot of trauma associated with that I didn't understand as being different from everybody else's life. But I then began to kind of see that, oh, this is actually something that a lot of Tibetans experience, and there was a big kind of click in beginning to kind of understand the impact of these practices in just helping anybody going through trauma. When I was still working for New York City Department of Correction when I did my first 2 dark retreats, and it was the second one, those 49 days, that kind of caused me to begin to understand that I should maybe leave that work and do something different. I was confiding in a friend who worked for the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice that I was leaving, and she asked me, like, why are you doing this? You're so great. Like, we want you to be here for a long time. And I told her about that retreat, and then all of a sudden she's like, oh my gosh, like, tell me about your experience of it. And I was like, well, like, in addition to the like Vajrayana context, like a contemplative context, there was what I felt to be a tremendous amount of healing of my own reactivity in relationship to habitual ideas around my own identity. And this friend of mine who's kind of like she's a big thinker, and she was like, oh my God, what if we could develop something like this for both people in custody, but then also correction officers, right? Both populations, basically finding themselves on this particular piece of land, and as a result of trauma, but then also this constant re-traumatization that happens, and certain things like the role of re-traumatization in law enforcement causes the law enforcement problem to get worse and worse, both people finding themselves in the carceral system, but then also people who work in law enforcement, the quality of their life, their longevity, all of the stressors on their lives just increasing over time. So even if these Dharma practices were to be brought into those arenas, I truly believe that it would cause a tremendous amount of shift and change for the positive. But then when you begin to look at the ripples everywhere, at least in the United States, where it just seems like we're constantly being re-traumatized, or at least the system, whether it's a political system or an economic system, is kind of based on ensuring that everybody's traumatized, so that they could also sell the response, the cure back. We'll traumatize you and then sell you the cure, and this is like a good example of samsara anyway.
Yeah. Lama, can I ask you something about that? So it seems like the potential for using Dharma practice, especially the kind of yogic Dharma practices, including dream yoga, Tummo, dark retreat, the potential for using those specific practices for integration of trauma strikes me as profound. I see with dream yoga, absolutely can directly work with the root of trauma. I see the Tummo entering into the inner fire of bliss, and there's so much. The dark retreat, I would like you to say how that might be helpful for working with trauma. Why is it, though, that it seems, unless you're talking to like Western Dharma practitioners, I don't think I must have, but it has been very rare that I've heard a Tibetan Lama or Tibetan Rinpoche talk about integrating trauma through Dharma practice. Why is that? When it's obvious for the Tibetan diaspora that trauma must be part of the psyche because of the absolutely horrendous situation after the Chinese invasion and beyond, and living away from your homeland, being torn from your homeland. Why is it so rare, or in my experience, that we hear Tibetan or Himalayan teachers talk about trauma integration?
Yeah, I mean, this is a good question, and I'll preface my response by saying I'm not an expert in being able to definitively answer this, but I'll take a stab. So I think one of the things that's important to remember is, and I know you know this, is that there is also kind of a cultural overlay too, right? That the Dharma and the what we might call the cultural form of Dharma practice, and even the art of Dharma practice, the existence of the sadhanas, the history of the sadhanas and how they were composed, the transmission lineage of different kinds of cycles of practice, all are heavily imbued within the context of the Tibetan cultural milieu, which is, to some extent, I guess you could say, the life force in how a lot of Tibetans identify themselves as Tibetans, right? Like, you can't separate the Dharma from that. And so I think that in some cases, there's a desire to want to, of course, preserve that, which makes sense, but then not change it, right? Not adapt it. I think, Dr. Nida and there are others, right? Who, and a lot of people, I was just talking with Zuri Rinpoche in Bhutan about one of my teachers, Gyaltsen Rinpoche. And, I was telling him that Gyaltsen Rinpoche on the outside, when presenting outward to groups of people, is a kind of pure Dharma presence in the sense of a very kind of traditional, pure monk, right? And then one-on-one, though, then he becomes much more kind of forward thinking, right? The what he tend to be actually shocked by, like, oh my gosh, like my whole kind of the journey with him had included him, suggesting that I open a Dharma center for him. And I'm like, oh, Rinpoche, like, I don't know if I'm qualified for that. He's like, no, you will be the teacher for it. And then, giving me authorization to give empowerments, and always just saying, do more in private. Right. And then in the context of the religious system, then he will kind of, be what everybody needs him to be. It's kind of a, authority, and almost like a chaplain, right? There to be able to provide spiritual support as well. So I think what's fascinating about this, though, is that there can be this point of contention sometimes where, in a very kind of pure-hearted, inspired way, as Westerns, like, we will want to see these innovations happen. And this can look like, I think, and at times feel like, an affront to very traditional Tibetans who are really kind of more concerned with the preservation of these things, which I think is kind of what goes back to the conservatism that you and I have kind of like touched on, right? Like, if I've never had the experience of there being a threat to the entirety of how I make sense of the world and contextualize the world. So it's very hard for me to feel in the same way this kind of difference. But what's also fascinating is, like, I was just in Bhutan and I was talking with Zuri Rinpoche, who's a filmmaker, and I asked him, Rinpoche, why are there so many Bhutanese Rinpoches who are filmmakers? Because there are a number of them. And he was like, oh, this is an interesting question. He's like, I think because for a lot of us, in the history of Dharma in Bhutan, there's been a long history of lineage masters who are also artisans or artists, like Kama Lingpa being a blacksmith. And what then I became curious about later that evening, when I was no longer with Zuri Rinpoche, so I couldn't check it, was this difference between, the high level trauma of, a Chinese invasion and then fleeing to India, and in the lives of some people. I mean, Akung Rinpoche is a really good example, and Trungpa Rinpoche obviously with him, is not only was it a shift from a very traumatic, right, intense journey from Tibet to India, but then from India very quickly to the UK, right, right into the heart of the West, as it were.
Yeah.
And how in one way, like Akang Rinpoche and Trungpa Rinpoche and others of that generation, like Chogyal Namkhay Norbo being similar, it's almost as if they shot forward several hundred years from like, the way society was structured in Tibet in the mid 1950s to 1960s Western Europe, right, in terms of view and all of this. So anyway, I think that there's a little bit of a lag for some people because of this reason, which I think is ultimately like a very reasonable reason, that but it does mean that for people like you or I or others, it's always helpful, I find, to keep one ear out, a very sensitive ear, to kind of check the impact that I'm having in the statements I'm making about bringing broad change to things. Right? And I think the one thing I do enjoy about like maintaining relationships with lineage masters in Asia is that it requires me to have one foot there and one foot here. And so there's this own, my own kind of like translation that I'm doing in terms of affect, right? Like when I was meeting with Chung Rinpoche in Bhutan about the Yangti Nakpo, I was with one of my students who was like, what about just like, giving this wholesale to everybody in the West because we need it. And, and I, I found myself caught between both of them. And I was like, okay, like, yes, I agree with you. But then Chung Rinpoche's, response is like, well, but this is a lineage that is sacred and we must preserve it. And I agree with him too. And so, I think just as much as what we might call the generation previous to us, who kind of helped to bring a lot of Dharma to the West, some of us might, and I feel maybe like I'm included in this, I'm still doing a little bit of this, like, dance between two worlds. Whereas, maybe, and I'm just throwing this out there, that you might be a little exempt from that. And I'm not sure if that's true, right? But that you have the ability to be a little bit more free in the expression of this. I don't know. What does that sound like to you?
Yeah. I mean, when at the start of this interview, when Steve said, "What would you like to be introduced as, Charlie? Do you have a title?" And I told him to introduce me as idiot, and he might do. Who knows? We haven't seen the intro yet. He said he'd use the Tibetan word for idiot. Your work as both an authorized Lama and a Western practitioner is brilliant and profound and radical. And also, exactly what you've said, because you are a lineage Lama, the dance for you must be much more subtle, I think, than it is for me, who has just got authorization to teach lucid dreaming within the context of Tibetan Buddhism, right? Not even the term dream yoga, because Lama Yeshe was aware that, that term is used in certain ways in this lineage. So yeah, I think I don't feel as tightly bound by that. And yet something I've just always tried to live by whenever I teach is I always think, if Lama Yeshe walked into the room now, would I keep saying what I'm saying? And I'm like, would I keep saying what I'm saying? And if I think, God, if he walked in now, I would change it, then I think I shouldn't really be teaching that or saying it. If it's causing that level of anxiety, then I shouldn't be doing it. Yeah. But I admire the dance that you're doing. This whole conversation has come from me reading your book, Modern Tantric Buddhism, and me writing that fanboy email to Steve and then him passing it on to you, because it seemed like not only were you doing this thing about like being a Westerner and a Lama, of who there are some, not loads, but I can think of maybe dozens, if not hundreds, but dozens. But the way you were doing this specifically in like the most ground level way, like, Chaplin working in Rikers and places like this, like I was like, wow, this guy's like really got both feet in these worlds. And That's something I would like to ask you about. Sorry if I'm becoming the questioner instead of Steve, but we've got you here. And like, I think it's so cool to ask these questions. Can you talk more about that, about how you see the application of Vajrayana practice, not only in the West, but in areas of the West where it's really obvious, tangible suffering, people who are really working with deep suffering in the prison system, in places of social deprivation, working also with dying people who are approaching death. Where's the application of Dharma there? Well, I know where it is, but tell us about the application of Dharma there.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, for me, I think all of this, the practical application of Dharma within the context of chaplaincy is a manifestation of the Dharma. It's one of the most powerful places we can practice. In Bhutan, I was with Chung Rinpoche, who was just getting phone calls all the time. Every night he's like, "Oh, I need to go. Someone died over here," and of course, I could totally understand that because this is what my life used to be like. But before becoming a chaplain, one of my teachers in Sikkim, the entirety of his whole spiritual practice, he was in his 90s. He was a student of Ani Shuksab. All he did was go from house to house to house, wherever somebody had died or somebody was ill or some tragedy had befallen people, and provide pastoral presence and do ritual and this kind of stuff. I think for me, like we can like contemplate the four thoughts that turn the mind to Dharma, right? And that's really powerful. But then we can also volunteer in a hospice in addition to, right? Or during the COVID pandemic, like the beginning part, right when the lockdown was happening in New York City, I was asked by City Hall to bless the bodies of all New Yorkers who were dying of COVID, and their bodies were being buried in the city's potter's field. And the chief of staff for DOC reached out and asked if I was willing to do that, and I like couldn't even get the words out of my mouth. I was like, absolutely. Like, I will definitely do this. Why? To be with death, right? Permanence, right? To be able to provide that level of care for people who have died, right? And their consciousness is in the Bardo state. And I think that it's been a benefit for my practice to stop and really get into kind of the more kind of existential side of what these contemplations really involve, which include impermanence and death and karma, right? The fact that things are constantly changing and that we're not in control, and the dissatisfactory nature of samsara entirely, right? All of these things allow us to be able to understand how precious the opportunity to sit down to do practice, or to do practice in the world, or for yourself as an expectant parent, right? To be able to begin to kind of understand how precious it is to be able to be a practitioner and be a parent, right? And bring benefit to a new life in that way. And then to learn from the chaos created by this new life coming into your experience of life. A long time ago, look, actually, but not even a long time ago, I tend to feel like the way we as a culture, if we can journey with people through their death in a full way that brings the Dharma, then Dharma has fully integrated into Western culture, right?
Yeah.
And so it became important for me to do that. And I think one thing that I only understood more recently is the impact that it had on other people, as kind of being something of an inspiration to be able to kind of do that too, But really the only reason why I did it was really for, just like you said, actually, like, imagining Lama Yeshe being in the room where you're teaching, right? And my root teacher, Adi Zangmo or Padang Rinpoche, or even Dr. Nida, like, just kind of imagining them being in the space with me, or Gyatso Rinpoche, and, using their felt presence as a way of understanding, like, am I giving absolutely everything to this
Yes.
now, right? Or am I, am I full of shit, right? Like, am I cutting corners, and so working on Rikers was interesting just because of all the violence, and so that was a really good way. I mean, like 5.5 years of being, heavily immersed in the response to violence, and then trying to create systems to address trauma for correction officers, for people in custody, for, non-uniform staff. It was a really rich way of kind of cutting into samsara itself and being witness to it. And then more than that, though, trying to bring some sense of openness and spaciousness to that. I think, we're so good at being good. And I think practice is the most powerful when we really kind of break it open a little bit and, see what's actually there, and then see, okay, like, how can I, let myself get really uncomfortable with Dharma practice, right? Rather than treating it as a cocoon through which I kind of separate myself, from the world. How can I actually use it as a way to kind of get rid of my defenses and directly experience my kleshas, and everything else, like that that causes suffering for myself and for others. I think there's a lot. I mean, and again, just as much as I really value the work that I've done in Vajrayana and at this intersection, the Zen tradition has been doing it much better for much longer, because, in the US, at least, in terms of like integrated chaplaincy, within the context of Vajrayana, there's a growing number of Vajrayana practitioners who are interested in chaplaincy. And I'm in the process of developing a chaplaincy program through, our center to be able to train, a nationally certified organization or a program, to be able to do this. Because it is also interesting, like even taking Nundro as an idea, as a concept, or as a system, how interesting would it be to, like, maybe add some kind of service like this to Nundro practice, because when you look at the early Kagyu, for parents, right, the trials that Naropa had to go through, and Marpa had to go through, and Milarepa had to go through, these kinds of things, I think.
So do your 100,000 prostrations, then go and do 6 months work in a hospice, or 6 months in a downtown London jail, or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
very interesting.
Yeah, and to get out of your comfort zone, to think differently, to see your blind spots, to have reality kind of kick you around a little bit, and then to see how you're fighting back against reality. Like, hey, I'm a Dharma practitioner, you shouldn't treat me that way, and that's a good reason to get knocked about a little bit more, not because we need to all suffer like that, but again, it's like, as long as we're holding on, and as long as we're reactive, and as long as we're, pushing things away, then we have a little bit of a problem that needs to be addressed. Yeah.
As the two of you are talking, there are some interesting themes that are emerging, and they actually line up with some of the questions I'd hoped to ask you. And one of those themes that's emerged, and Justin, I think you spoke to it most directly, and I think, Charlie, you spoke to it, you implied it. It's this tension between conservatism and reform, or perhaps even revolution. The shadow of conservatism, you could say, is stagnancy. It becomes a sort of shell, an empty form, not in the good sense, not in the Buddhist sense of emptiness. of course, its virtue, its good side, if you like, is preservation of precious things. On the other hand, reform, its downside perhaps is, well, you never know if the Jenga brick that you take out, Charlie, you walk into a Gompa maybe in Nepal and you see the monk sitting in front of the nuns and you think, that's not right. I'm going to pull that Jenga block out. And that, okay, maybe that's okay. But then there's another thing you're looking around thinking, well, that's not right. I don't like that. That doesn't align. That's not good. Pull that Jenga out. Eventually, it could be the case that the shadow side of reform is diluting or rendering something kind of a soup. It's neither this nor that. It becomes a sort of defanged version of religion. And this is a criticism, I think, that's been leveled at various Christian sects and denominations. I've heard this quite often, that in attempting to meet the culture where it is, religions can lose that which it has that's a refuge from the culture. There can be such a diluting of its sacredness, of its demand, of its rigor, that it becomes a sort of watered down version. Watered down by what? Well, watered down by the culture. And it loses, therefore, its sort of flavor. But of course, on the other hand, reform is necessary to some degree, or renewal maybe, is necessary in some degree to avoid stagnancy. So this is an interesting tension to adjudicate, especially in the position that the two of you are in, teaching sacred, hitherto secret practices under the auspices of lineage authorization. This is quite a curious challenge, I think, that lays before people like you. So I wonder, what do you think of that? How do you adjudicate? And then we come down to this other binary of that Justin, you mentioned there. What is real religion and what is merely cultural overlay, if I exaggerate the point a bit. The implication presumably being that cultural overlay is optional, but the real religion is the thing we want to keep. That's the baby in the bathwater. So how do you decide what can be jettisoned or reformed, or how do you decide what's in the purview of revolution? And how do you navigate this tension between conservatism and revolution? I think you've already spoken a bit to that, Justin. So I'm curious, perhaps first, Charlie, what your thoughts are in response to that.
I don't think I can match the kind of the level of philosophical questioning that you might be hinting at. But what I will say is, as you were speaking, I was thinking, as a classic Buddhist thing, is there a middle part of this? So recently I did a workshop called a Dharma Dummy's Guide to Dream Yoga. And it was actually the first time in 15 years that I've taught the proper dream yoga stuff, because there is quite a lot of stuff, not much from the Kagyu tradition, but from the Nyingma traditions, which can be taught openly and actually doesn't require the long retreat. And there are certain practices, for example, the Chenrezig dream yoga practice, which can be practiced. You don't even take refuge to do the dream yoga Chenrezig practice. So you've got this full-on practice of saying the mantra in the dream, deity self-manifestation, full classic kind of Tibetan dream yoga stuff, which actually everybody can do. So I presented this workshop, and to come onto the workshop, it wasn't kind of strict. I didn't kind of check people's calling cards, but I asked that people who attended the workshop had taken refuge or had a strong connection to Buddhism. And it seemed that doing this, I thought, might lead to very small numbers. I thought, I'm kind of shooting myself in the foot here. There won't be many people. But actually, it was a really well-attended workshop. And there was something really nice about being in the space where I knew people would understand what I was talking about. And I didn't need to, as I might do at a public workshop, kind of say a Buddhist term and then feel a need to validate it or make a joke about Harry Potter, or I often do think, oh, Harry Potter's got nothing on Tibetan Buddhism, haha. This kind of thing. I could just speak and I could teach on this stuff that I knew and had been waiting to teach on for a long time, and that felt really nice. And it felt like there was a freshness to it, but still a safety, because I knew everyone had taken refuge. or most people had been asked if they had taken refuge before they attended. I think there's also a next step to that is stuff around the Nundro. Like, I'm really into the Nundro, and it's quite rare that I find people, Western practitioners, who've completed their Nundro. And I say rare just as in like statistically rare. Like, of course, I know many dozens of people who complete their Nundro, but I don't know hundreds. But I know hundreds of Western Buddhists, Tibetan Buddhist practitioners, but not hundreds who completed their Nundro. And I think there's a way that we can ask people to really do the practice. And the Nundro is such a good practice to do because it asks so much of you and it's so complete. You know, I just kind of didn't stop doing it, right? I just kind of like carried on, but just without the counting for the second bit. It's such a complete practice, like a meal. You know, it's got a starter, it's got a main course, it's got the dessert, it's got bits that make you completely question what you're doing. I mean, for a Westerner to be dropping and doing 100,000 Buddhist burpees, so much of that, your mind's going, what the fuck am I doing? This is nuts. I've joined a cult. My knees hurt. What am I doing? And then you get to the mandala practice and you're like, what am I doing? What am I doing? There's rice everywhere, imagining like, you know, cosmic imagery. It's so good for the ego of the Westerner, I think, because it's so far out, because it tests you so much, because it really asks, like, how much are you willing to do for this practice? So I'm actually really for things like Westerners completing the Nundro. And to kind of complete my point is, I would also like to do a workshop, a Dharma Dummy's Guide to Dream Yoga for people who've completed the Nundro. Because then I know, okay, then we can really, there are some practices which I wasn't able to share in the first one, which we could share here, in that safe container of knowing everyone here has really put in the work. Now, we're still not on the 4-year retreat, where, of course, much of the stuff from the 6 yogas in Europa is shared within the Karma Kagyu lineage anyway. But at least there are practices that we could offer where we know everyone in the room has really put in the legwork. And completed the preliminaries. And I think there's that middle path where we're not saying like, let's water it down. I'm saying do the Nundro. Like whenever I meet a Western practitioner, I'm like, you're doing your Nundro? And if they're not, I'm like, oh, dude, do your Nundro. There's nothing like it. I mean, it took me like over 10 years, right? I'm such a terrible practitioner. But whatever it is, it's a long thing. It's a big thing. It's an audaciously huge thing. The numbers, they're kind of crazy. You know, 100,000 might as well be 1 million. But there's something about that I think could still be really beneficial for Westerners to ask people to complete their Nundro. But then once they have completed the Nundro, then like, you know, being a bit more open with these practices, saying, okay, you've really done that. You've gone through the Nundro, you completed the Nundro. Now we can be more open with these practices without insisting that people go on the 4-year retreat to do them, because there are just so, I think nowadays, even fewer people who can really commit to doing that because it asks so much of your life. And I've had, again, dozens of friends who completed the 4-year retreat, and many of them have enjoyed it and loved it. But I've got to say, a few of them, it kind of wrecked their life. It wrecked their life. They came back and found themselves pretty much unemployable. Their savings had gone to nothing that they kept in anything that they had kept in the bank because of the interest rates and stuff like that. Yeah, I don't know. So I think it is, if there is a middle path, then can we find that isn't diluting? We are teaching proper Dharma, but we're teaching it in a way that is more accessible than it was.
Yeah. I mean, I love what you say about Nundro, Charlie. One of my teachers was the previous Boka Rinpoche, and he had this Mahamudra seminar that I think he kind of took on from previous Kala Rinpoche. And in that system or that context, he would ask people to, you know, he taught a very traditional program. It was about 5 years. I did 7 years of it. And I had already finished my Nundro by the time I started it. But what he had asked people to do is to try to commit to 10,000 of each per year.
Oh, cool.
And I found it to be a really happy medium for people who ended up receiving, you know, the same kind of Mahamudra instruction that, you know, he would teach in you know, the 3-year retreat systems, or for people who had, you know, finished, you know, long retreat. And it gave people exactly what you say, right? The benefit of, you know, the foundation of Nundro, which is just, you know, an incredible thing.
And Lama, is that a thing? Sorry, Justin, Lama Justin, is that a thing? Because I've heard Mingyur Dorje Rinpoche doing that too, offering. Oh no, maybe it's Zongse Khyentse. I can't remember. Maybe I'm conflating the two. But one of the two is offering a version of Nundro, I think based on hours. They were like do
Yeah,
a certain amount of hours rather than accumulations. Is that correct?
I've done a bit of research into this. Yeah, I'm not sure with Mingyur Rinpoche what he's doing. I know that within the context of Shambhala, this is what they did. They took a
Oh,
time period, like do it for, I don't know.
oh, maybe I'm conflating the two then. Maybe it was Shambhala, right?
Yeah. And then, the 17th Karmapa, Urgen Shinle Dorje, he developed that Nundro that was just 10,000 of each.
Yeah.
And I was in Bodh Gaya when he gave the transmission for that. I thought that was really great, but it was really funny being in the audience there. A lot of Tibetans were like, "Oh, this is just like, and this is American Nundro. This is not like
Oh, sorry, Justin. That's interesting. So I had heard of the 10,000 version of Nundro before, but I didn't know it was like required a transmission. So there was a specific. It's not just do 10,000 of the Nundro. There is a certain Nundro where you just do 10,000.
There was a text that he
Oh,
wrote,
I see.
and it was kind of remarkable because he gave it in Tibetan, then he gave it in English, then he gave it in Korean, and then he gave it in Japanese.
What he was doing the Lung in all the different languages. Wow,
Yeah.
that's cool.
Yeah, it was pretty neat. And that's a good thing. And then I know that Trungpa Rinpoche then set up a system for there to be like a 10,000 accumulation for the lunch and Nintik, and also was it the Pema Nintik, the Terma cycle that previous Dilgo Khyentse revealed.
Wow.
And
I did not know there were so many 10,000 options. I wish someone had told me before I did the 100,000 one.
No, well, maybe
It would have saved the scars on my knees.
Yeah. And so these innovations I think are good, and useful, right? In the sense that and even in the Yangti Nakpo, like in the Yangti Nakpo, it's sometimes if you've done a long Nundro in another tradition, you can do a shorter, 10,000 accumulation of all the foundational practices. So I think this is a good innovation. And then though, what I'm interested in, I am really fascinated by kind of like going back in time a little bit to kind of like the classical Indian model of doing things where, so for example, like, rather than do like a 3 or 4 year retreat, to do one yidam practice and just focus on that, right? Rather a whole cycle of yidam, like, so in the Karma Kagyu tradition, you do Vajrayana, then you do sometimes Hey Vajra. But if you already feel a connection to Vajrayana or Vajravarahi, like just focus on that, right? And with the 6 yogas, you can do all 6 of them, or it's usually the case that if you learn all 6 of them, that there'll be 1 or 2 or 3 that you feel a real connection with. Some you might not feel so much of a connection with. So I think, Steve, kind of going back to your question, or kind of this proposition about how to reform without jettisoning, the spirit of this. I think that there are a lot of different ways of approaching the tradition itself, and really like the 3-year retreat system, even the Nundro text, right, that you find in the Karma Kagyu tradition is not necessarily that old, right? And the concept of Nundro, the Nundro practices are old, right? Those extend way back into medieval Indian period. But I think that if we can take a decent, like, heartfelt look at the breadth of the tradition and how things have changed, we can then kind of get a sense of not how we need to change things, but where there is some wiggle room to be able to make adjustments to fit kind of the cultural needs in this moment. I think the other thing is that it's with respect to, change making over time. I think you're 100% right, Steve, that there are certain things that might be a little non-negotiable, but it requires people to uh, acclimatize or to kind of harmonize themselves with those things so that they can understand them. There's a certain amount of stuff that I think that can be changed and shifted without losing the essence of this. But I think that we need to, more people who are deeply appreciative of kind of the energy of the tradition itself will be able to navigate what can stay, what can be modulated. And I think I would actually even make the argument that I think that modulation might make better sense on an individual basis. Right? If there's somebody who comes to me and they say, oh gosh, I've had, all of these dreams of, Che and Machi Globetron. I've felt a connection to her my entire life, and now, I would like to receive the empowerment for Che and receive instruction for Che. I would be much more willing to just give this to them without any kind of nundra or as a basis or anything, if that spirit of connection and it's clear that this person has kind of a level of devotion to it, the practice, and a willingness to practice it, and that there's some kind of connection that's not easily described in a materialist way. I think some of these things, Steve, that you mentioned about how much harm can be created by too much change is when the changes are just made basically only on materialist values, right? Or, so if it's just, so I'm all for the social change within the context of Vajrayana, so that it's less patriarchal and, and so that it is not, just the plaything of, white college educated elite, right? So, I would like to see this kind of trickle down into the kind of core essence of Western culture, period. In order for that to happen, it needs to be kind of on one level made more ordinary and less foreign and less exotic and less also even for me, like the thing I do love about being Kagyu and Nyingma in practice orientation is there's such a long-standing tradition of pushing back against philosophical snobbery. So to be the person on the street, as it were, like the beautiful thing about the Mahasiddha tradition is that these are like a kind of ordinary people bringing Dharma into everything that they do. So I think more even kind of revolutionary change to be able to have Dharma be ordinary and not this overly shiny thing is necessary. But the thing that's really important is just remembering the profundity of all of these things, right? That like each deity, right, is kind of a live presence, and they are the nature of our mind, right? That the protectors are real, right, and powerful, and not just necessarily, can be reduced to some kind of like archetypal concept or, but this is also not to say that we can't also approach all of these through the lens of some kind of Jungian archetypal psychological view. And at the same time, I don't think it's wise to reduce it all down to that either, right? So to be able to be, what I'll say is a very close Dharma sibling of mine, she and I were having this conversation, and she was telling me how much she had been thinking about this, the relationship between being a wisdom keeper and a lineage holder. Right? And a lineage holder is somebody who holds a lineage, right? And there's an element of formality to that. There's, it's wisdom that is passed down, but the wisdom keeper is kind of like the person who is in communion, so to speak, or in direct conversation with the beings that the lineage holder is holding the keys to the practices around, right? And so what I think in the West, we would all benefit if there were Western wisdom keepers, right, who might be anonymous, right? They might just be the people, they could be in urban areas, they could be in rural areas or suburban areas, but they're the ones who are kind of, they're like the Ayukandros or the, Anishuksebs of the practice world, right? And then there are the people who are more at the intersection of the religion itself, right? And these people need to be in communication with one another in order for the most skillful change to happen. I think though that we are in the midst of these different roles arising here in the West, where there are people who are much more kind of concerned with just being attenuated to the energy of the tradition. And then there are others who kind of are more attenuated to the kind of pastoral needs of, the flock, as it were, and helping to guide, Dharma in the most appropriate way. And then, of course, we have people who are not interested in that at all. The one thing that those folks, I think, run the risk of, I believe, is becoming irrelevant over time. This is kind of like how some Dharma centers, unfortunately, are more like Disneyland in the sense that everything is preserved perfectly, right? But there's something about the essence, right? There's a slight essencelessness, a slight lack of spark, and I think what would, a loss of kind of existential vitality, right? Dharma is really about the, this intersection of experience of appearance in the moment, right? That's very immediate. That's very charged. That's able to be experienced right now, as opposed to something where we're all playing dress up and it looks and all of that. Maybe that's needed sometimes, but I think, some centers and maybe even some lineages to some extent run the risk of kind of going down into this very kind of dry, woody kind of territory. I do feel like there are a handful of people in the West who are, though, moving in this wisdom keeper and this lineage holder, kind of direction that will be that are important. The existence of these people and the increase of these kinds of people will help ensure that Vajrayana here in the West becomes, what some people will hate to hear, like Western Vajrayana. And I think it's inevitable for this, the flavors of whatever it is that our diverse cultural needs are, ends up manifesting in the way the tradition is.
That's very interesting. Two things you said there. One is that before one seeks to change a social context, one ought to, I think the word you used was harmonize oneself with it, or at least attempt to understand and appreciate it. I think that's an interesting point. And you also said that on an individual basis, teacher to student, one-to-one, for example, there is more latitude there for reform. And I think that's always, or for just doing things differently, I think that's always been the case. But I'm hearing something else that's interesting too, which is sort of two-way social revolution. On the one hand, adjustments made to the religious tradition and its structures, social and even, in fact, the format of its practice. And on the other hand, change in Western, as you both are saying, American, British, whatever, culture, you'd like to see that influenced by or changed by some of the values that you feel Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism has. It's unclear to me if there's a third entity, which is the thing you really like to push, that requires both of those directions to change in conformity with it. And if so, what that is. But I'm curious, what are the other criteria of adjudication when it comes to this tension between conserving and changing, between adjusting oneself to what's already there and adjusting what's already there to what to oneself. And by oneself, I don't only mean the individual practitioner, but also perhaps your sense of what the cultural needs are. People don't have time. Charlie, you said, for example, a 4-year retreat, it depletes their savings. They become unemployable. This is some of the but Nunro's okay. So there's a decision there that's Nunro is good, but 4-year retreat, not so sure. So what I'm curious are the criteria, some of the criteria, if we think about that, for adjudicating what we choose to keep and what we choose to jettison. What are the guiding principles, if not the religion itself and its existing forms, because we're going to change those, and not quite the culture you're coming from either, because you also want to change that. There's some other thing that you're working from. So I'm curious, what are the guiding criteria? Charlie, why don't you start? Because I think, Justin, you already touched on some of those things.
I was going to say, just before Justin actually gives a true answer to your question, hitting all of those philosophical points that you're raising,
Charlie, it's not a philosophical question. So is it that you don't understand what I've said, or is it that you don't want to answer it, or what is it?
No, it's that I'm deferring to my elders here, but also I guess I'm being playful here. But something I would like to say is the 4-year retreat is a very good idea. And as I say, from the dozen or so friends who've done it, several of them have become Dharma teachers and have written amazing books and really engaged the Bodhisattva ideal. So it's a brilliant idea to do. But yeah, there are a couple of people who I know who've done it and have in their words, not mine, they said, kind of wrecked my life, man. So it was just offering that as a potential. Before looking at that question, something that Justin was saying that came up that I kind of wanted to mention, it just kept coming to my head, is there's, when he's talking about the wisdom keepers and the lineage holders, there's a concept from the Toltec Mexica tradition, which translates as like the Nal's Courier, the Nal being the kind of a person of spiritual power in this tradition. And the Nal's Courier is not a lineage holder, nor a wisdom keeper, but a student of the Nual, the kind of the spiritual teacher, who is their courier, who does their bidding, who basically kind of travels around and spreads the good word of that teacher. And it's a concept that I've often related to a little bit. I not that I am, but if in any way I could be something, I'd love to be the Nal's courier for Lama Yeshe being the Nual. And I think there's a lot of very strong Western practitioners who also hold that mantle. At the beginning of the talk, when I mentioned how Dr. Nida first came on my radar, it was actually through his students. I kept on meeting just loads of really solid younger practitioners who were linked either directly to Dr. Nida, or the other one is Lama Lina, who again isn't someone I've met, but I've heard great things of. And these people seem to be embodying this idea of the Nal's Courier, that they had this kind of young, youthful, and quite Western energy. But when you got down to it, they were proper practitioners, and they were really helping to kind of spread these ideas of the Dharma on their teacher's behalf. And I think that's a really interesting concept. As far as your question, Steve, yeah, I think I didn't understand some of it. But also, I think because Lama Justin is a Lama and really has 2 feet in that world, is really kind of a representative of the lineages, as well as being a Westerner, he is far better placed to answer that question than me.
Well, if I may, you're an authorized teacher nonetheless, and I'm curious about your opinion. And because Justin is here, it doesn't mean that your opinion is invalidated or shouldn't be heard. I mean, it's a dialogue after all. You've got a lot of valuable things to say. That's why you're here.
Absolutely. I'm not kind of I'm not deferring to some false modesty, but I do feel that, as Justin put his finger on earlier, I don't have such experience of this because, and I say this really luckily, thank goodness, I haven't been given any title or anything like that, because as Lama Yeshe said recently, actually, I think he's been very aware of the relationship we've had. He said recently, just a couple of years ago, he said, he said, basically he said, we have a system. And he went, me and you. He went, you teach people how to practice in the nighttime. Once they know, you send them to me. You send them to me, I liberate them in the bardo. And we had many years of where at the end of all of my retreats, when we were talking about kind of integration and what to do next, I would send people to go and see Lama Yeshe. Well, this must have been more than 5 years ago, actually, because his health has declined in the past few years. And very often after a retreat at Holy Isle, which I think is the place I first met you, Steve, actually, people would go straight from that retreat to Samiling to see Lama Yeshe. And he'd always say, oh, Charlie, you send me all your people all the time. He kind of teased me about it. But he would give them interviews. And I would ask people afterwards, like, what did he say to you, to kind of see what he was saying? And he wasn't saying the same stuff. I mean, there was one person who had zero Dharma, seemingly to me, they had zero Dharma experience. And he told them in their next lucid dream to visit the hell realms and to say many mantras to the beings they find there. And I'm like, whoa, he's talking about liberate beings in a hell realm. And then another woman who was like a proper, like long-term boomer practitioner, had been in there since the kind of 70s. And he gave her, I think it wasn't really anything. He just said, just be aware that you're in the dream, which maybe was a more profound teaching anyway. But I think in that way, he has set up a relationship where I don't actually step on many toes, because he's been very clear with what I can teach and what he can teach, and the way that I can teach people the basics of this practice and then send them to him. And he clearly said, you send them to me and I will liberate them in the bardo. And I don't think he was over-exaggerating. I really think that anyone who has made that trip to see him, they've made that connection. And in the bardo, I trust his word. I think he will liberate them in that way. And yeah, when I say that, I think, yeah, maybe this is an idea of the Nal's Kuriya. And maybe that is the role that I play. But because of that, I really haven't got much to say about the kind of dynamics of the way the lineage moves forward, because I'm authorized to teach a certain thing within the Karma Kagyu lineage, but I'm not like an authorized Dharma teacher, as it were. You know, I couldn't just like start teaching the Nundro. Sometimes I wish I could, because I really wish there was someone who'd done it, who could break it down in a way that's like really understandable, but that's not in the remit. It's just for doing the lucid dreaming and dream yoga stuff.
Well, before I hand to you, Lama, I mean, you did begin the interview making social comment about both Asian religious contexts and Western religious contexts. And I assumed that there was some guiding principles or criteria underneath those comments. You, for example, mentioned nuns sitting behind monks, and then you also mentioned whiteness and these sorts of...
Let's go to the nuns sitting behind monks, because I let that one slide when you were saying about pulling the Jenga piece. I truly believe that is a Jenga piece we need to pull. Absolutely. And I know that Lama's primary teacher, Lama Justin's primary teacher, was a woman. And one of my primary teachers is a woman, Lama Zangmo. And Lama Yeshe has famously made more women, Western women, Lamas than men. And he was the first Lama in the West to find a way around, to find a loophole in the way that Western nuns were not able to take full ordination, because that ordination lineage wasn't still alive in the Tibetan tradition. So we'll take them to the, I believe, the Thai or the Chinese tradition, where the lineage was still alive, and he took the nuns there and they took full ordination. And it seems crazy that someone like Lama Zangmo, who, I mean, maybe now her credentials of Lama are different. Actually, they move her to a different line in the monks and nuns. But it seems crazy that a female practitioner who has done all of this practice and has all of this wisdom and this knowledge and the hours of practice beneath them still sit behind a man. That is a Jenga piece I can see no reason not to remove. Also, I would love to see the look on some of the more conservative Tibetan Lamas' faces when a monastic turns up who identifies as a different gender to which they were born. Where do they sit? Do they make another row in the middle for someone who with male genitalia but identifying as a female? You know, these things are going to come up soon. Zongsa Kunse Rinpoche I was listening to, and he was saying, he was kind of playfully saying there must be more than 100 genders now. And the audience kind of cracked a laugh, and he said, "This will come to Bhutan. Don't you think it won't? This will come to Bhutan soon." And the audience kind of stopped laughing. I thought, yeah, okay, this is really interesting. So I think that does need to be confronted. There is no reason why. In fact, in many of the Vajrayana texts, it says it's easier to reach enlightenment in the body of a woman because the way the channels are positioned than a man. And yet we still have this inherent misogyny that runs so deep within the culture and then seems to be played out even further when it meets the Western culture, which has inherent misogyny within it. I don't know, man. That's a Jenga piece I think we really need to pull out. And I don't think it will topple things. I think it will lead to a whole something much greater coming from it. But I don't know, Lama, what do you think? Like, is it just an old cultural hang-up that we've imported from Tibet? Is there a reason why nuns with much higher levels of attainment and practice than men should still be have restricted teachings and restricted access?
No, yeah, no.
I'm glad you agree.
No, and I mean, having just been in Bhutan, one of the things that played out is on our pilgrimage tour, there were a few people who identified as transgender. And in some of the temples we went to go visit, I tried to get everybody into the protector shrines, right? The gong.
Yeah.
And, there's a policy in Bhutan that it's men only. And then, of course, this becomes, so that already kind of, irritated all the female identified people. And then for the people who were, non-binary.
Yeah.
Then this was a doubly confusing thing for the Bhutanese there.
And how did that play out, Justin?
So it played out, everybody deferred to the custom that, rather than kind of pushing it, which I think ended up probably being, I don't know, in my opinion, a little skillful, just in the sense of not being, an overbearing coming and pushing, trying to kind of transform people's views, quickly, overly quickly. But I agree. I agree that this is, I mean, it's not located just in Western culture. I had the opportunity of reading my root teacher's, some of her journals from when she was in long retreat at Sharabling. And she wrote some really beautiful and scathing kind of, commentary and critique on how frustrating it was as an ani to always have to sit behind the most junior monk, so yeah, I mean, that is completely, in my opinion, completely arbitrary. There's no good justification for something like that, these days. And kind of going back, Steve, to your kind of question, I think the other thing though that is really worth remembering, or at least for me to remember, is that these lineages are not they're not ironclad, right? So even if you take the Karma Kagyu tradition, even within the context of the Karma Kagyu tradition, yes, Karmapa is the head, and yes, we'll make certain decisions, or advise monasteries so people shouldn't eat meat and things like this. On a regional basis, or an administrative basis, there is a lot of diversity in terms of how people respond to things and solve problems and attend to these things. The Nyingma tradition is even more diverse in terms of all of these different kind of sublineage systems. So we will talk very broadly about the tradition itself. But it's actually a lot of different moving pieces, most of which are much more kind of organic in their formation than necessarily top down. My personal critique of the Karma Kagyu tradition is that it is too top down. It doesn't make any real sense to me to have such an intensely structured tradition, especially because it has such an intensely yogic formation, right? Coming from Tilopa, Naropa, Marpa and Milarepa, and then even at that point, there's still this kind of yogic thread that had continued for quite a bit of time. This is just my opinion, but I think that ultimately the arbiter of this kind of change is two things: time, right? Time will decide what lasts and what doesn't, which I think for me ends up being a good reason to say, hey, let's try change and let's see where this lands, right? Some of these things will survive, some won't, some, very orthodox leaning sanghas won't survive. Some that are way too loose won't survive, and we'll see. I think though, how to be able to really understand if impact has been made in any of this change is, obviously defined by the quality of the practitioners that are generated. And I think that it's probably a little bit more skillful for, so for example, Charlie and I are both good examples of this. People who are specialists, right? For teachers who specialize in a handful of practices, right? And can provide support and education and training for people in these things. So for example, within the context of Dzogchen or Hatha Yoga, like, this can include Trekcha, this could include various Togo practices, including dark retreat. If people are able to recognize the nature of their mind, right, and develop a firm, stable relationship to this and a deepening of practice, that's how we know that there's success in this, right? If that's what the focus is. Or with Tumo, right? If one is able to produce either the heat or the bliss or both, depending on what arises more for them, and then this allows for the transformation of mind, then that's how we know, right? With dream yoga, the same thing, mastery of dream yoga. I think this kind of like era of pundits, like, the great masters who, around, so I'll say Gyaltsen Rinpoche, in my opinion, is like this. He's one of these people who I like to call him like, the lion of siddhas, right? I think that he has a very broad mastery of a tremendous amount of Dharma, including things, outside of the Karma Kagyu tradition. This is rare, right? This is rare because most people don't have this training. If more people had the training for this, then you would have more people like this. But in more modern times, I think that it's probably more realistic that it will be a little bit more like you found amongst, the yogic practitioners of medieval India, where there would be people who were specialists in things, specialists in yogini tantra practices, specialists in the philosophy, specialists in devotional practices, specialists in more emptiness based or open awareness practices. That leaves me hopeful also, because it means that there has to be a wide variety of people who are holding the mental peace, rather than just a select few who are, have a big basket. I would much prefer to study with somebody who's a master in their tradition than somebody who holds a lot of things and you don't really know how well they've actually gone into some deep experience of those. And I think that will also probably be a decent way of kind of gauging, right? Like how successful all of this is. I will say, if I can, kind of going back to this other piece, is I would like to see, one of the things I love about like Dr. Nida and being, Dr. Nida's student, is that he's also a father. And so every so often, and his kids are, I think, like 1 year older than both of my kids. So my sons now, and I actually have three sons. One is 25, who I've dragged all over India and Nepal, when he was very, very young. And now my young ones, they just came on their first trip to Asia, to Bhutan, being a parent, I remember I found out I was going to be a father in Bodh Gaya. And I was doing Kora actually with a friend of mine, like a Dharma practitioner who was British. And he literally said to me, "You've had a good run. It's a shame you're not going to go any further now." You know, basically like, it was nice knowing you. You know? I guess I'll hear from you in the future. And I was so irritated. You know, and I was also irritated that we were doing Kora around the stupa, and I was irritated with him. And you know, I kind of made this vow to myself there that, like, you know, I'm gonna really, like, not, you know, this is one of many things happening in my life right now. This is not going to be an impediment to anything. And of course it wasn't. It was ironically an impediment to all very orthodox Karma Kagyu practitioners I knew, where they were like, "Oh God, that's unfortunate. Like, you really had a lot of potential." And you know, this needs to change too, because I you know, that same year I remember meeting some guy, like, he was like from Amsterdam or something, who told me, like, with a big smiley face during dinner one night at some tent restaurant, that he had left his wife and child, you know, to become a Dharma practitioner and to seek awakening. And you know, I was a little like, whoa, like, you know, okay, like, you know, we read this in the stories, but let's see how this plays out. And so later the next week, you know, I went go into the same tent restaurant, and he's chatting up all these women. And I was like, oh, I see how this is going, right? Like it's very easy to get kind of sucked into the romance of, like, you know, you can't do this in a kind of, you know, lay system. I'm very grateful for Dr. Nita as a Nakpa teacher, and the existence of Nakpa culture to kind of poke a hole in that. The other thing is, when I was just in Bhutan, I had the special privilege of becoming friends with Khenpo Sonam Dundrup, who was a Khenpo at Namdrolling Monastery, who had been appointed after Shedra onto the board of directors for the local hospital close to Namdrolling by Penna Rinpoche. And it was the same hospital that then, when Penna Rinpoche was dying, he was in. And Khenpo Sonam was his primary caretaker. And he really, you know, got to spend, like, the last bit of time that Penna Rinpoche was alive with him one-on-one. And he was telling me, he was like, you know, everybody makes such a big deal out of long retreat. He's like, but if you can rest in the Rigpa state all the time, right, and make that the focal point of your practice, it doesn't matter. Like, long retreat is technically not important. And he was like, you know, remember this, like, in whether it's raising kids or working or, you know, supporting people, right? Like in the US here, now that, you know, Trump is going to become, you know, president, will be inaugurated in a couple of days. You know, a lot of people are going to need support. Do that and rest into the, you know, like, if you can have, some people will say, oh, that's unrealistic. I don't think that's true. You know, this is the core essence of what practice has to be. If we can, you know, bring this level of practice to our daily lives, this then also becomes a way of understanding that practice is developing and flourishing here, right? But if we have kind of very wooden metrics, which, you know, again, I'll throw a little lob of you know, light criticism towards some, you know, Dharma lineages, where they will just use these rather wooden metrics to determine whether or not somebody is authorized to teach something or not. Metrics that are wooden, anybody can accomplish, right? Resting into the nature of mind and having a deep relationship to that, and being able to help others experience that themselves is I mean, we could even say a little bit beyond that. And this, I think, is inevitable, that there will be more and more people in the West, whether it's the United States or the UK or continental Europe or Central America or South America or anywhere in the world. There will be people who can do this. This is not just, within the purview of a small group of people.
That's really inspirational to hear you talk about that, Justin, especially the fatherhood stuff. And that kind of pledge you made to yourself that this won't be, well, it may be a defining aspect of my life, but it won't be a limiting aspect of my life as far as my Dharma practice goes anyway. I was having a conversation with my friend Lodro Rinsler a couple of weeks ago, who's a teacher, used to be in the Shambhala tradition and now teaches by himself. And he was saying that it was quite rare to find dads who were also Dharma practitioners. And I was like, we should totally do that, like dads of Dharma. And we could run courses. I was like, you do the meditation stuff, I'll do the dream stuff. Lama Justin, this is now my request that you'll come and teach all the wonderful practices that you offer. I think there is something, if we could get, in the same way as that workshop before, I knew everyone had taken refuge. I would love to do a workshop where I knew everyone was a practitioner and they were a dad. And that we could, especially with the dream practices, I mean, there's loads of stuff, whole techniques based upon disruption of the sleep cycle. Is okay, if you're with a 6-month-old and they're waking this amount of times in the night, try this one. If you, I don't know, whatever, who knows? This is all theoretical, right? We'll see. Ask me in a few months' time. But there's something really inspirational with that. And especially with the Kagyu, this is the householder lineage. It seems crazy that a lineage literally called the householder lineage now has this kind of idea that, and again, I've had that, not quite as extreme, but that response from a couple of people where they've given me pity eyes, where I've told them about becoming a dad. And I'm like, this, oh God, you're not going to do much practice now. And I'm like, dude, every moment will come practice. How am I not going to be practicing patience when there's this being that's made of my DNA screaming in the middle of the night when I'm, in the middle of a great dream or something like that? I think the whole thing will be practice, or the whole thing has the potential to be practice. And again, it's all theoretical right now. Ask me in 6 months and I'll probably be, completely sleep deprived and saying there's no way I can do practice. But to hear you say that and to hear other people like Lodro Rinsler talk about that too, I think there's a real kind of gap in the market of Dharma practice there and Dharma teaching of people who are parents and practitioners. Maybe that's it, not Dharma Dads. Maybe it's Parent Practitioner should be the name of the workshop. But I'm excited about that. And it's nice to see people like yourself who've done it and are living examples of that. And I look forward to the time where I can take my daughter to Bhutan. Maybe she won't want to go. Maybe she'll hate all the things her dad loves, but who knows?
Yeah. I mean, we can take this in every direction. I mean, there's something that Tricycle is reviewing that they're going to publish that I wrote for them. They reached out to me specifically about like ordination, even like, how important is that? The friend of mine who works for them, who sent me the kind of initial query, had related to me that they had wanted to be a monastic, and then life circumstance prevented them from doing that, and that they still, and it's now been like 10 years or something, and they still feel this kind of failure on their part. And I was so happy to get this this query, because I was like, oh, let me offer my thoughts on this, that it doesn't matter, right? That like, whether or not one is ordained as a monastic, or, I brought up like, whether it's a nakpa, ordination kind of thing, or even in the Karma Kagyu, like, it's much more rare, but this repa, kind of, ordination, that, or even if you don't have any of those and you're just practicing, like, we can all achieve liberation and we can all achieve liberation in this lifetime, right? But I don't know where and why this, well, I do actually have some theories. I mean, when the kind of initial forms of Dharma that were, especially Vajrayana Dharma, that were introduced to the West, were monastic in origin and monastic in expression, then everybody feels that, oh, I need to be this way. Or if I was able to be ordained as a monastic, then I would be a serious practitioner. And I'm not, And so that makes me a less serious practitioner, or, oh my gosh, you know, God forbid, I'm now going to become a parent. I'm even lower than, you know, a non-monastic practitioner with no children. And that makes, you know, what once one has a direct relationship or direct recognition of the nature of mind, the logic behind that makes absolutely no sense. It is completely, you know, is a complete projection, right? And I think that this also still needs to be integrated throughout Dharma circles, because the fact that, I mean, I literally kind of giggled to myself a little bit when this email came to me. I was like, oh my God, like, you know, this, I'm so happy, you know, I can be of support to this person in this way. And again, you know, most of my teachers have been monastics, and I respect that, and I value that, and you know, I celebrate that. And but you know, my root teacher told me privately, you know, she became a monastic because there was no other option for a Himalayan laywoman at the time to be taken seriously, to be taught, you know, of the full range of everything she ended up being taught. So even within the cultural, you know, milieu in Sikkim, or, you know, Tibetan cultural milieu, like, you know, sometimes people make these hard decisions because they're not going to be, you know, taken seriously or heard. That is another good reason to kind of re-examine, you know, access to Dharma. Yeah, you know, I don't, it's I think in the West, like, we could deal with spending a lot more time really feeling into who it is that we really are before we make some of these decisions. Because sometimes I wanted to become a monk, and I came literally like minutes away from becoming a monk. But my root teacher told me, she, you know, she was the person who was going to ordain me was Pating Rinpoche, and he didn't have scissors, so he couldn't do the hair cutting. So I had to go into Gangtok to get scissors. And I went to go tell my root teacher, I was like, oh, I've got such great news, I'm going to become a monk, you know. And she she did not waste a second, and she said, you know, that's the stupidest thing you could do. Like, you know, don't do that. Like, I don't want you to do this. You know, this is going to make problems for you. Like, you know, there's no support for you, you know, all this kind of stuff. And I did not stop to consider it. I was just very, you know, externally oriented. Oh, well, but then I'll be, you know, ordained Sangha, and that's a good thing, you know. And she's like, you know, you're not thinking, right? And her specialty was Mahamudra. And she was like, you know, if you just practice Mahamudra, it will happen, right? There's no, what you wear or even the vows you hold, right, don't make your Mahamudra practice any better than if you don't have those, or if you wear Western clothes, or if you don't wear any clothes at all, right? Like, how does this, that's superstition. And so that's worth, you know, people considering for themselves, you know. So in that way, like, I wasn't particularly surprised or freaked out when I found out I was going to become a parent. It was more that rather than long retreat, I'd spent so much time going back and forth between here and Asia that I had no money. So then I was like, oh, I need to figure that out. But yeah, you know, and you know, Charlie, just kind of what I was thinking when you were telling me the story about some of the kind of, like, you know, glances that you may get. I mean, you as a parent is a blessing, right? Think of how amazing, right, the opportunity it is for, you know, your child to have you as a parent, right? That is something that a lot of Western Dharma practitioners never really had the opportunity to have. You know, a lot of at least, you know, older Western Dharma practitioners I've met have had relationships with parents who, you know, question their interest in Dharma, you know, or don't support it, you know, or think it's strange. But no, actually, you have this opportunity to kind of create a supportive ground, you know, for your child, should you want to do that, which is so special.
Yeah, I hope so. And whether it's a ground of Dharma or just ground of compassion, like all of this stuff, all of this training we do, this mind training, I'm like, well, now the rubber hits the road. Let's see if this stuff works, right? First of all, all the sleep training, I'm like, okay, there's going to be the biggest impact on your sleep coming. Let's see. Do these practices hold up? Do they work? Do they allow you to bring that mindful awareness into sleep that's so disrupted and broken? All these practices on patience and serving others. And, let's bring that into force. Let's see if that works. So, yeah, I'm excited about it. I'm excited. Oh, there's something you said about how you dodged the bullet on being a monk reminds me of what Lama Yeshe told me. My mum was scared that I was going to become a monk when I started working very closely with Lama Yeshe, having a very close relationship with Lama Yeshe. So he said publicly to her, but in front of a big group at this retreat, he went, as long as you're alive, he won't go into robes. Now, my mum died a year or so ago, and I've been on tenterhooks for the last year or so, thinking I might get the message coming through. But I think with the baby coming, I've dodged the bullet again, so I'm all right.
That's a good thing. That's a good thing. Yeah.
Well, thank you both. This has been so fascinating, such an interesting discussion, certainly. And, you're both contemporary Buddhist teachers teaching, different slices of Vajrayana Buddhism, each of you, in today's world. And it's been such a privilege to have you both here. Thank you both for coming and considering these tricky issues. We talk about things like conservatism or reform, these kinds of difficulties. Of course, it's important, I think, to reflect on not merely what we'd like to change, but why. What guides? You may be right in the change you'd like to make, but if you don't know why you're right, then any other change you might make or might seek to make, it's got really a random chance of being right or wrong in a sense. That's why I was, in a way, pressing you both to consider one layer beneath what you'd like to change and to consider why. Or in other words, what are the criteria? What is it that's going behind it? It seems to me this must change. It's not really good enough. Even if you're right, you can't repeat that rightness necessarily later. So I think that's very fascinating indeed. When it comes to this idea of culture and Dharma, the essence, it's in a way, isn't it, like a nectar or water, let's say, with a container. You need, in a sense, perhaps the container to carry the water. But you wouldn't drink the container, would you? And it would be a shame to have the container and forget to drink the water inside. So sometimes I think this is a metaphor that can be quite useful for considering things like culture and Dharma, or even the person and Dharma, as you've been pointing out, Lama Justin, that maybe individual people are as much a container as a cultural form or an institution is. So I think these are all themes that you've been bringing out, the two of you, in this discussion that I've personally found very stimulating indeed. So thank you both. And if you'd like, I invite you, both of you, needn't be the case if you have nothing you'd like to add. If you have any concluding remarks that you'd like to offer, then perhaps we could end in that way.
Thank you for being part of this dialogue. It's been fascinating. And thank you to Justin for writing the book, Modern Tantric Buddhism, which, begun this, my fanboying email. I think it's so important that there are teachers like you doing this and asking these questions, and that we're able to have this forum where we can discuss these questions too. And also for anyone listening who is a practitioner, I guess kind of words of encouragement, like keep practicing. This is a practice. We can't just read about it. We have to really be doing this practice, and whatever practices you're doing, keep doing it. And even if it's a small amount, but regularly, can really do great things. And of course, it's brilliant if we can go on long retreats. And absolutely, if you have the time and resources to be able to, please do. And also, if you are not, and you are in really everyday samsara and part of the grind, if you can bring your practice into that can become a retreat in itself too. I really believe that.
Yeah, Charlie, I want to thank you for having this opportunity to get to know you better, and I admire the work that you're doing, and it's been a pleasure to be in conversation. And Steve, Guru Viking is my favorite podcast, and
Mine too. It's so good, isn't it? Like his questions, it's next level. I mean, the way he just gave the outro there, I was like, dude, you just don't get this on other podcasts. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, no, yeah, and but yeah, Steve, I just want to let you know how much I value all the work that you do in picking everybody that you interview, but really this is a place to be able to ask and explore these less common kind of questions. My advice and just hope for everybody who is watching this is keep going and take yourself seriously. My root teacher told me, she said those exact words, she said to me, take yourself seriously, take your practice seriously, have faith in yourself and trust it, and keep going and keep going and keep going. And maybe I'm a little bit at the age now where I might be an inspiration to other people, and it's been useful for me to kind of remember back to those people who were an inspiration to me, who I reached out. And I just want to say to everybody who is continuing to practice in earnest and doing the hard work of exploring what that means, may you too become then an inspiration, so that we have this lineage that keeps going and is organic and will bring benefit to everybody. So it's a real pleasure to be here with both of you, and a pleasure to be here with everybody who's been listening or watching.
Well, thank you both for the kind words about the podcast, and also for this wonderful dialogue. And maybe there's a future collaboration here between the two. Daddy Dharma.
Daddy Dharma.
Well,
you heard it here first.
That's right. As you say, Charlie, rather a gap in the market there. Somebody get that.com. Okay. Lama Justin Van Boydash and Charlie Morley, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.